Thank you for joining us. My name is Monica McNally. I am on the Board of Selectmen, and I'm also chair of the Great Island Advisory Committee. And I want to give a thanks to all of our committee members that are actually here or will be on site this afternoon helping out. I also I have a couple of announcements. I want to thank the Board of Selectmen. I want to thank the Great Island Advisory Committee, and I want to thank town staff, especially Tony Campanella and the Department of Public Works. We have been looking forward to letting you know when expanded access will take place on the island, and it's in effect as of today. So what does that mean to you? Well, two things. Dogs will now be welcome on paved areas only on the island, and that is in effect until March 31st of this year. No, 25, sorry about that. And also we've expanded access for people that want to walk around. So there are certain areas that are blocked off. You'll see maybe barricades or roping. We're asking you to not go into those areas. We're asking you to remember that we do have tenants on the island, and be sensitive to that. And I just want to remind everybody that that there's private property. So when you enter Great Island, the property on the right, including the gatehouse, is private property. The town does not own that. Okay. All of the other rules and regulations that were created and are on the map, on the sign on the island and also on the website are still in effect. Specifically, there's no vehicular access, no cars on the island except for town work, and no bikes at this time either. As far as today goes, really excited to see all of you, and again, a big thank you to TV 79 for taping this. I hope whoever wasn't able to join us this morning and see this presentation will tune in and watch the video then. I do want people to know that there is room left on the bus. Okay, we have 2 buses and we have plenty of room. So, and at this point, I think it's, if you want to take the bus, just be here at 1 o'clock. So the bus will be picking up people, not here at the circle, but in front of Town Hall, but in the lower parking lot. Okay, they'll be picking up at 1 o'clock, so if you want to ride then, great. I know a lot of people are parking over at Pear Tree and walking over. I want to, again, thank Linda and Karen. I don't know how they do this, but they get the weather done, so it should be a good walk there. Let's see, and we will, the bus will be dropping people off at the stables. So if you're parking at Pear Tree and you're walking over, that's where you want to meet us, okay? That's where the tours will start, is at the stables. Anybody that wants to go into any of the buildings, we're asking you to sign a waiver. There will be waivers distributed on the bus, and we'll also have waivers at the stables. So if you're interested in going into any of the buildings, we're going to ask you to fill that out, or just sign it before you join us. And again, welcome, and thank you so much for being part of this process. It's really important to be involved in every step of the way. So I know I've seen some of your faces, and I see a few new faces here. Please continue. Every one of these public engagements and surveys will be different and will build off of the last. So please stay involved. Thank you. Oh, and here's Becca Sturgis and Meg Crisco.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, everyone, for coming this morning. I know it's always a little tough to show up at Town Hall on Saturday morning, but as Monica said, it's critical for your community and for us who are trying to lead with you the process of determining the best future for Great Island, that you join us in this. And so it is just of great, great value and appreciation that we welcome you today. We have I think a kind of lively, but also we're trying to keep the pace relaxed and conversational as much as possible. So there's real time for interaction at the end of our presentation. And we have some boards here. Many of you got to look at the boards from the last outreach event that are now sort of decking the halls, literally, of Town Hall. And we want to have the chance for our team to speak with you in more one-on-one or small group conversations. So please take advantage of that time if you have questions or observations that you want to share once we complete this presentation to everyone this morning. This is a sort of simple structure that we've set up for the conversation this morning. We're going to have a brief introduction. We're going to share with you what we've heard to date. And again, that's high level because we only have a little bit of time with you this morning, but pretty much all of the documentation of what we have heard is available on the website. And so if you have something that you want to dive into in a finer grain, we welcome you to look at the website and follow up in that way. We also wanted to take advantage of you being with us today to share some of what we've learned through our process of analysis and discovery about the island and the structures and the history and the ecology. So we have not just sharing back to you what we've learned from you, but what we have learned independent and in partnership with the community and the experts around here about the island and Darien. So there are 4 of us, in addition to Monica, speaking with you today. Becca Sturgis from Reed Hildebrand. I am leading this effort on your behalf. Meg Griscom, next to me, she's the project manager at Reed Hildebrand. We are landscape architects. Josh Wilson, seated in the front here, he is our chief ecologist, helping us understand the habitat and the issues around the environment on Great Island. And so he'll be sharing some of those findings. And then George Knight, our sort of architect-in-chief, so to speak, and he will be sharing what we have learned to date about the structures on the island, and you can see even here some of the beautiful drawings of those buildings, because we need to understand all of that history and all of that which exists before we can make really sound decisions about going forward. And so we're excited for you to learn more about that. Just quickly, for those of you who are interested in process and where we are in decision making and determining a future, this is a 1-year process that we're embarked on with you of setting up a plan to guide the future of the island. And that is meant to be an incredibly participatory, thoughtful process. We also know that there's been a big investment, and there's a lot of eagerness to enjoy the island, and so also trying to work briskly in partnership with the GIAC committee and the community is another one of our charges. And I think, as Monica announced today, ensuring that there's a way to have access to the island that is also safe and respectful has been a major desire, and I think we can celebrate today that that access is going to be safe and much broader as of today. So that's an exciting thing to get to celebrate. In terms of this 1-year process, there are 2 big chapters. And the first one, which is almost on a semester basis, we kicked off in the middle of the summer. And we've been doing our homework, learning, getting to know all of you. And the point of that is that as we kind of conclude this fall and winter phase, we arrive at a sense of shared values and goals and a shared understanding of what is basically known about the island. And from that, we summarize that into a pretty succinct statement with some documentation that is a vision for going forward. And so we are now past the midpoint of arriving at that vision, and there'll start to be indications in what we share with you today of where that vision is headed. But basically, the winter will launch with that vision statement. And then we'll begin what is typically a really kind of fun and very animated process of testing different scenarios of how do you interpret that vision and actually carry it forward as a community and on the land. And so that's the master plan and the concept, and that will take us through to midsummer. We will basically arrive at the blueprint for that plan in May, and then there'll be a set of fine-tunings, and we'll share that out with you in a kind of big celebratory conversation in May. We like to show this process also in this way because the reality is we all try to have organized and linear lives. Maybe not all of us, but many of us try that. But the reality is that it's a much more woven and blended sort of system of interactions and relationships. And there are these process points. There are these moments where everybody wants to come together and you kind of try and see the same thing. And then you go off and you make your own decisions and you do your own work. And then we have to come together again. So today is one of these moments of coming together. And as part of that, we're not just having this conversation this morning, we will be launching our second survey. And that second survey will launch today at noon. We are hoping, for those of you that filled it out, you will follow through and also fill out this survey, and that you will broadcast its presence to all of the other community members and people you think will care about it so that they also participate. We will be reaching out to everyone who participated in the last survey to encourage them to participate in the second survey. And if you participated in the first survey, you will note that we are digging into some of the things that seem to be broadly in agreement for all of you, and some of the things where there was difference, right? We want to understand division and agreement in this process. And then in the afternoon, there are these tours, there's a tour for understanding a little bit more about the trees and the ecology. There's a tour, just to show the actual agenda, there's a tour to take you into the interiors of some of the really significant architectural buildings and learn more about those spaces. And then there's some children's activities. So we're hoping that people come and enjoy them, and if you know some kids that are at a loss for what to do this afternoon, please bring them along or encourage them to join. There is a sort of self-guided tour, and we'll have a table if you're one of those people who really likes to go your own way. You're welcome to do that, but we have sort of developed something that will help you understand. So Monica mentioned this, it's also posted outside, but the bus will leave here at 1 p.m. Please come, get aboard, and come enjoy these tours this afternoon. We also, just looking ahead, wanted to share, and this is a draft date at the moment, but the next big community effort will be once the vision is sort of out there and published, and we're starting to test scenarios. So we will be convening another community session and workshop, most likely around March 1, but again, this date will firm up. We didn't want to do it during the school holidays because we want as many people to be present, and so much of February actually becomes out of bounds because people are off doing other things. So what have we heard? We have heard many, many things, and we're basically thrilled that we've heard as much as we have. You did a great job as a community showing up at our first event. These numbers in terms of attendees are estimates, but we think we had around somewhere between 60 and 100 people in the morning event, and then closer to around 200 people came out in the afternoon. And it was a nice mix of some people who did the full day and actually a bunch of new faces in the afternoon. And we expect that to be a little bit true today as well. One of the things that we like about these workshop events is that they're personal and they're a little bit more relaxed. And so while in terms of sort of quantitative information, it's a more anecdotal and relationship-making set of experiences. So, a lot of creativity and kind of setting up conversations that are really important for current understanding, but also stewardship going forward that happen in events like this. So we see these as community building and really, really important. This is just a photo of the map at the end of the day with all the ideas that had accumulated over the course of the hours. This is a drawing, and again, you can find this online if you want to think about it a little bit more. But this is a drawing where we've summarized the sort of broad agreements and findings from that sort of polka dot, almost confetti-like distribution of ideas that were represented by those Post-it notes. And just to highlight a couple of things, you can see that there's some areas on the island that people really love, that they feel so natural, right? And a sort of desire that they stay kind of feeling very, very natural. There are other areas where The idea that walking paths get improved and there's a lot more access, there's broad agreement about that. The need to have parking, something that we've been talking about from the beginning, also a kind of clear statement, but with that actually a specific sort of note that if it could be green in some way, that would be desirable, and I think that that's pretty telling. And you can see too that the idea about parking, it's sort of concentrated toward where you arrive on the island. Water access, very, very interesting to many people. So we have a suggestion box today, and we really encourage you to take the piece of paper, which you can fill out with your suggestions, and offer suggestions. One of the things that's nice about the format of the suggestion box, and you can see we got 45 contributions to that last round, is it's sort of long format. You can write as much as you want, and we will read it all and record it. And so for those of you that really feel like you have a lot you want to say, this is a great way for you to share that. The survey is necessarily a little bit more compressed because we're trying to get as many people and be as objective as possible with the survey method. In terms of key themes that kind of came out, there's a lot of conversation around preservation and conservation and those importance, sort of how to think about access and transportation and get people to the island and make that feel really fitted and also open. And then how do we think about the use of the buildings and the facilities? I think you can see the note here about disabled access. Something that I'll talk about more going forward is just actually how broad the consensus is that making sure that we make this island comfortable for people of all ages and sort of physical abilities. A lot of mentions around ideas of conservation and preservation, hope that we can preserve as many trees, that the habitat is cared for and sort of just as alive and thriving once we develop the island or bring it into the future it is now. Concern when we look at access and transportation that the way all of that access is achieved, and there's really deep consensus that access needs to be brought to the island and not just be for people who live close by or are really comfortable making that trek from Pear Tree, which is a little bit hazardous for some, but that it be really sensitively considered and integrated into the fabric of the island. In terms of building and facility use, this is where I think a lot of the dreams of the island or sort of fantasies are quite broad. Many people have very specific in particular and almost like about their hopes for their own lives, futures that they can imagine for these buildings. I will say things like being able to throw a great party or wedding in either the stables or the manor house. There's a lot of interest in that in the community. There's also interest in, is there a way to have some level of support for some of your cultural or educational organizations here really be housed in one of these facilities? You can see the note too, which will come up in a moment, but how do we do all of this without too much work being made for the community and too much cost is an issue. So moving on to the survey, it is astonishing the level of participation we saw. We got 2,374 respondents to the survey, which represents more than 10% of your community. You should be really proud. Just like that is a really phenomenal level of participation in something that really did take time and that people put a lot of thought in. We are hoping that with this next survey we see at least a close to equivalent level of participation. So please, like this is a loud broadcasting from us, please participate, please encourage everyone to participate. As you can see this morning, there aren't quite as many people here today as there were in the first one. That is normal when you're running a good process because it means that people are feeling a little bit less anxious than they were before. But we do not want to drop off in participation. And the survey will be open for until the Wednesday after Thanksgiving. So that's enough of my advertisement. But please do get people to participate. So in terms of what we heard, there was a lot of agreement that the island is beautiful, that it's natural, that it's quiet, that it's restorative. And so I think one of the big challenges for all of us and for the plan going forward is how do we preserve the sense of nature and quiet that, somebody used the word untouched, or pristine is a word that's been used. It's not actually untouched. There's a huge amount of development. Those buildings are enormous. There's a lot of infrastructure. But it is a place where you feel kind of that it's your own special island, and that you've gone quite far away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. And so how we preserve that is going to be one of the big challenges for us. In terms of priorities that came across clearly, at the very top, this issue that we need to make this island accessible and inclusive, just broad agreement and kind of positive energy in the responses around that. How we think about education and cultural opportunities, again, a lot of enthusiasm and sort of sense that that's really a positive good for the community. At the other end, where we started to see a lot more sort of either nervousness or wariness about what might happen, or debate, is around things like, should there be a pickleball court, or do we need a swimming pool as a community, and if we do, does it belong on Great Island? And so those are some of the questions that we'll be looking in more closely. And you can see at the very bottom, I think everybody is concerned about the budget and where money is going. At the same time, there is real reservation about what level of commercial activity is going to be the right level, if any, on the island. And so that's something that we're really going to have to spend a lot of, I think, time and energy getting right. So highlighting just a few things around accessibility. The idea that this is a place that you can come on your own, come even with your dog, come with a family, come with a small group. Lots of excitement about that. But there is, I think, and this is not a surprise given the way the paths are and the roads are now, a sense that it's really not safe or comfortable for people who are either very small and in a stroller, or just learning to walk, or if you're at a moment in your life where you've just had surgery or walking is challenging. It's not set up for that right now. And so a call to us to figure out how we can make those accommodations so people of all ages are really comfortable on the island. And the idea that it's not just comfort in the beautiful days like we're having today, but that all year round there's meaningful access and use and sort of purpose on the island is something that we heard about. And so I think that is one of the roles potentially for cultural and educational purpose or programming on the island, so that there's sort of, it's inhabited and has use all year long. In terms of community and recreational facilities, some broad consensus around things like, kayaking is very popular in the community, and there's a sense that, if there could be more, and if we could figure that out, for instance, for the island, that would be great. Curiosity about things like kids' camps, and this issue of how the walking trails and water access combine is something that I think we've basically been directed to find some good solutions for. Oops. So development and preservation. This is where things get a little bit more dicey. I think everybody knows that taking care of these extraordinary structures is something that feels right and important, and there's some debate about how much and in what way, but how that happens and then how is it done over time and in a cost-responsible way is also something that I would say has come forward as a directive. And there's a lot more to be understood within that range. How that all happens while honoring the ecology and nature that's on the island is something also that people have called attention to as a priority. And so we're starting to think about ways to do that, and we'll be thinking really hard in the coming months about how to take a preservation and conservation lens while making sure that there's use and animation activation. Sports and recreation, this too, a lot of excitement and kind of consensus that the island feels like it's suited to recreation. passive recreation is where there's the most consensus, and then is there targeted activation in specific ways or specific places? That's something we're going to be evaluating. And here we thought this quote was particularly sort of symbolic of a lot of the voices that have come forward, but an interest in how we balance what happens here and making sure that views from the waters, views for people who are there, like the basic experience is not damaged, even as some level of activation or development may need to occur. I'm now going to have Meg give you a little bit more, sort of, for those of you who like graphs and not just quotes and broad declarations of themes. She's going to walk you through some of that.
Good morning. Can you all hear me all right? Great. If at any point you can't hear me, please just raise your hand and we'll make sure that we speak up a little bit. So the slides that I'll be presenting will help to explain in a little bit more detail some of the findings of the survey. Again, I do just want to note that for those of you who are really interested in going into the detail and going down the rabbit hole, all of that very detailed information, even more detailed than what we're going to be presenting today, is on the town website and it is on our website. So by all means, you're more than welcome to access that and really study that if you have greater interest. So, of the phenomenal responses that we received, over 2,000 responses, what we saw in terms of programs and what the constituents would really like to see, really the highest ranking ones were passive personal use, recreation, health and wellness, sustainability and ecology, and education. So those are the top programs that the respondents were really interested in. In terms of the finer grain of what happens within those types of programs, we really saw a tremendous amount of consensus with residents really wanting to have access to walking in the site, to enjoying the views, relaxing, dog walking, being a part of nature, water activities. So here we go into a little bit more detail relative to that. You'll see that the percentage as you get towards components related to perhaps, education or specific programming related to, revenue generation, those percentages start to decrease a little bit, but by and large, the shared values really indicate a preference for passive personal use, health and wellness, and recreation and ecology. So, not surprisingly, given the amount of coastal access that Great Island provides, the highest number of respondents really wanted to see water-related activities. And that makes perfect sense because having publicly accessible coastal access public space in Connecticut is so highly valued, and so that's really clearly a need for you all. Interestingly, we were surprised to see that actually respondents really also like the idea of events and performances and festivals. So, there seems to be a very strong desire to have some type of planning and event component on the site that can be really about engaging you all and bringing you out there on a regular basis to have activities to engage in. And then, of course, in terms of, the highest percentages of with whom do you go to public spaces? Not surprisingly, it's family, it's taking walks by yourself. A lot of respondents indicated that they like to walk dogs out at Great Island. So, we know that this really is desired. It provides a high value for you all, and being able to spend time out there is really important. So, as Becca alluded to earlier, where we really see the most alignment in terms of community engagement here, it's really about preserving the natural beauty, minimizing development, having walking trails, really having accessibility for all, having community gathering spaces. Where we see the community being a little bit divided, it's really on the topics of level of development, whether or not there's a town pool, whether or not there are organized sports fields, whether or not to allow dogs on Great Island, what type of car access or parking might be provided. And then where the community tends to be kind of semi-aligned, it's on the themes of educational opportunity, water access and views, restaurant event venues, and this idea of resident-only access. So as part of our outreach, we also have been engaging in several focus groups with the community. And so we have held 7 focus groups with key members of the community. Ecology, with the themes of ecology, education, transportation, governance and revenue, water, youth, history, and preservation. And out of that, we really had 3 common themes come forward. So again, there's a strong value for ecological stewardship and sustainable access, educational programming and community engagement, and preservation, adaptive reuse, and resilient design. So we wanted to take a little bit of time today to talk to you about the actual site and to make sure that you all have a shared understanding of what part of the site is within this scope and is actually part of Great Island. So this diagram here represents the entirety of the peninsula, but an important clarification is that, you know, the original sort of 1980 estate boundary is this red line that extends all the way around the site. The shaded light red area is private property that is not owned by Great Island. Additionally, the darker red areas of open space A and open space B are also private. They are open space, but they are not part of the Great Island vision plan. Additionally, this parcel 23A, which has scope related to the entry drive and the tree removal, that is also not part of this scope for the Great Island Vision Plan. So what is part of the Great Island Vision Plan is everything that you see in white. Going into a little bit more detail, it's important to really then be able to focus on what some of the restrictions, particularly governmental restrictions, are that we really need to pay very close attention to. So we have regulatory restrictions here on site that we have to be very sensitive to and pay very close attention to. So we know that we have the 100-foot coastal setback, which is that dashed hatch here. We also have to be very mindful, obviously, of the FEMA 100-year flood line, which is this light pink color. And then additionally, because we do have some very sensitive ecologies on site, we have inland wetlands with their associated 50-foot upland review area. And then most importantly, you know, we do have a state and federal recommended guideline, which is enforced in terms of providing a setback for the bald eagle nesting area. And this is during its nesting period of February 1st for July 15th. So February 1 to July 15th. That is the federal and state recommended but also enforced setback area. So again, this is something we want to be very careful about and very sensitive and mindful of as we move forward. So then looking specifically at some of the infrastructure on site and working to understand what some of the constraints might be there, we know, for example, you know, there's a tremendous amount of beautiful rock outcrops, you know, on the island, all across the island. But in terms of access, you know, many of those have slopes over 25%. Many of those are areas that, unless you're really fully ambulatory and mobile, can be prohibitive in terms of site access. We also know that several of the buildings, which we'll go into more detail later on in our discussion today, several of the buildings do not have accessible entries, so that's an important consideration as we move forward. And then we also know that we need an emergency access route, which is required, which is this hatch line here. That's the current paved road. That is a requirement to keep. Additionally, we also have to be very careful about walking surfaces that are unstable. So for example, the bridle path here, which is not a paved surface, that is technically not ADA compliant because it is a unpaved walking surface. So as it relates to us meeting the mandate of providing accessibility for the residents of Darien, there are a lot of considerations that we have to take into account. When you start to look at the combination of the site restrictions and the site constraints, you begin to understand that actually, really, in terms of what's available for any real change on the island is actually quite limited. So this is the compilation of all 3 of those formo diagrams. It's really just the gray areas here that you see in the diagram that don't have any constraints or restrictions on them. So we want to share this with you just to help you understand that this process of working towards a shared vision does require a lot of very careful negotiations and considerations for what mandates we need to meet and where we have constraints and restrictions that we have to follow. As it relates to ADA accessibility, we do just want to touch on a couple of themes here, and we did go into a little bit more detail in the JIAC meeting last week. But for ADA accessibility, the primary considerations really are walkways. So we have to pay attention to the percentage of slopes, cross slopes. We have to look carefully at surface materials and make sure that there aren't any abrupt changes in the surface materials. We can't have grates, covers, or speed bumps or anything that has any vertical change that doesn't have any, delineation or capacity to adapt. In terms of pedestrian infrastructure, we know that amenities such as restrooms, handrails on steps, lighting, wayfinding, and signage, those are all critical to providing true ADA accessibility. And then more than just the physical infrastructure in terms of accessibility, it's really important for us to make sure that we're thinking about accessibility related to experiences and activities, right? So making sure that there are outdoor event areas that are really truly accessible, that the water access can be made accessible, and that even the views actually out towards the water can be made accessible. So those are all factors that we're working to really make sure that we bring into the discussion. And then, of course, building entrances, right? So making sure that we have accessible entrances into some of these beautiful historic buildings on site. And George will speak in a little bit more detail about this later on, but one of the key findings here is that, of the 9 buildings here, we have approximately 5 for which making 60% of the entrances accessible would require minimal work, which is a good thing, right? That's some minor regrading at the entrance. It's not a huge amount of work required to make some of those entrances accessible. But conversely, 4 of those structures actually would require rather significant adjustments to their entrances to make them accessible. And that involves perhaps a ramp or a lift. So the broader take home here is that as we work to really figure out how to repurpose the buildings and the structures on site, what are the complicated and tricky set of negotiations that we make relative to which buildings we preserve, which buildings we make accessible. If we make them accessible, how do we make them accessible? How do we make them accessible in a way that doesn't compromise their architectural integrity or their history? So there's a lot of factors at play here relative to the decision-making process. This is a natural segue into having George speak to some of the architecture, so I'll hand it to you now, George.
Thank you, Megan. It's very nice for me to be here. I appreciate your time on a Saturday morning. As Becca had mentioned, I'm a principal with Knight Architecture, and we are looking particularly at this magnificent set of buildings that exist on Great Island and studying them. And I wanted to share today some of the preliminary findings that we've been making over the course of the last few months. Fundamentally, there are 3 paths of study that we've been working on. One of which is the architectural history of this set of buildings. And we've had quite a lot of success from diverse sources gaining some information about the history of the island and of the building. It begins, of course, even pre-colonial history of the island and the region. The Siwanay Sachendom of the Wappinger tribe had the settlement here that as the colonial period arrived, became Middlesex Parish, and the Selleck family was associated with this property and Long Neck for more than 2 centuries. And then it's really about 1902, which is when William Ziegler Sr. buys the property and really creates the estate that we start to know much more documentation, have much more documentation. I'll say still that the documentation that we have is fairly limited. We've been very well served by your town historian, Sarah Kina. We've been able to walk the site with Ned Steinkraus. We've got a lot of personal experiences of those who have lived and experienced the buildings and the properties and the houses. We've done quite a lot of research into the architectural history of the properties and the buildings, with some success and still a good bit of uncertainty. We don't have as much documentation as we would like, but we have made quite a lot of progress and developed what I believe to be really solid understanding of the history of the buildings, which I'll very quickly go over here. We know, for instance, that William Ziegler Sr., who bought the property in 1902 and really first turned it into this great estate, was a Mason, as was his son, and that Ziegler Sr. encountered an architect who was fairly well known for Masonic temples, Harry Knowles, and we believe that at that moment and through that connection, that Ziegler hired Knowles to design the bulk, the core of the masonry buildings on the campus, as it were, beginning with the gatehouse that one passes through, no longer part of the property. The main house we date it to 1903, 1904, knowing that the property was built in 1902, though we don't have any original drawings of the main house, shown here on the upper right hand, or the middle. We know that the stables were a second stable that was built on the property, the first having burned. We believe that it was, again, Knowles who built the original stable in wood, but after the burning of that barn and stable, William Ziegler Sr. commissioned a fireproof building, which brought not just Knowles to the project again, but the Guastavino Fireproof Building Company, who produced those beautiful vaults that those of you who've been in the stable know and will see this afternoon. We also know, and there's a drawing in the lower left that is, in fact, from the Avery Library, Columbia University archive of the Guastavino drawings for the very stable building on the island. We know that as William Sr. died and William Jr. took over the property and the house, significant alterations were made to the main house. So, for instance, you're seeing fundamentally three-story house with a tower form facing the water in the upper middle image. That whole third floor was really removed, and there was a restylization of the house towards a Mediterranean character. The porches that you see left and right of that tower were removed. There's a loggia that wraps both on this side and the front that was removed and transformed. So there's been significant alterations. It's our understanding that much of this was done through the work of Addison Meisner, a Florida-based architect, and we've searched his archive and are continuing to search his archive, trying to find proper documentation of his involvement. But we know, for instance, that he worked in Darien at Weburn, and that there's quite a lot of conjecture that he worked on this property. We know that the Zieglers were building properties in many different parts of the countries and spent a lot of time in Florida, and we have a strong speculation that they encountered Meisner's work there. So the house today doesn't look at all like what was shown here, but rather has a Mediterranean roof, much more low-slung, and the addition of a villa to the south. In addition to Meisner, William Lawrence Bottomley was certainly involved in the construction or adaptations to the main house. We know this because not only was Bottomley working with the Zieglers on a private residence still standing in New York City, but we actually have found drawings on site. I had them in my hand, a small fragmentary drawing, nothing of any significance other than it has William Lawrence Bottomley's name on it, and it associates with alterations that were made in the main house, particularly in the dining room and some of the rooms upstairs. We have speculation that Bottomley was involved in the design and construction of what was originally called the Playhouse and is now called the Pink House, which was a structure that was really for the children of the Ziegler family to use and to as a nursery, effectively. In addition to the historical research we've been doing, we have also commissioned a documentation survey of the building and the island, which has involved drone photography, a point cloud, LIDAR point cloud, Revit models. So we have a great deal of documentation now. It's just come in, and we're sort of taking sort of raw data and turning it into usable planimetric drawings and other types of drawings that will allow us to better assess the types of uses that Becca alluded to that will be a next step for us in this project. These are examples of some of that product. And the third strain of work we've been doing is associated with facilities assessment of the buildings. We're working with a partner firm, Wisjani Elsner, who have been doing a survey and study of the building's structure and envelope, their roofs, walls, windows, et cetera, to give us a sense about where these buildings stand relative to their state of repair. So for instance, we know and knew from day one that the Manor House, which hasn't been occupied for 50 some odd years, is in a much different state of repair than, say, the stable. So these, and you see some pictures here of various conditions. So this has been an analytical process for us. We've been basically researching and drawing in as many findings as we can, but it's allowed us to start to make, provisionally at least, some synthetic conclusions about the property, and we see these as being a series of criteria that will help you, the town and the committee, make decisions about how best to go forward with any one of the buildings. For instance, based on a number of criteria, we've tried to lay out a provisional ranking of the historical and architectural significance of the buildings. In doing this, we've taken into mind the significant contribution that the Ziegler family, for instance, has made to industry and equestrian culture. We've taken into account the architectural history and the value to American architecture of the designers of many of these buildings. We've taken into account the way in which the buildings interact with the design landscape. And we've taken into account the rarity, frankly, of having an open landscape such as Great Island in an otherwise very highly developed Connecticut coastline, which has allowed us to, again, organize 3 tiers, wherein we put the stables as being an exceptionally significant building. I think in large part because the degree to which they are so close to the original construction. They've been almost unaltered with the exception of the stable ring that was built behind the main building. And then in a different category, but still considerably significant, the estate house, the carriage house, the boat house, the playhouse, and the greenhouse. And then a third tier retaining a good deal of significance, but below that second tier, the White House, which is important to say is the oldest structure on the island. We believe it dates to the Selleck ownership of the island, and that there is part of that house dates to the 1820s. It's difficult when you look at it because there have been, we believe, pieces of historical architecture that have been brought to it that weren't part of its original construction. But we know there is a small part that indeed predates the Ziegler era by perhaps quite a lot. The bathhouse, the beach house, and the squash courts, which come almost as a little packet of buildings, waterfront buildings that also retain some significance. And then I'm hoping that you will all and others will be able to join the tours that will happen this afternoon. We'll begin in the stable building, and many of you will already know the stable building. We will move to the main house, where we'll be able to enter into some of the public rooms of the main house. And I'm sure none of us will be satisfied with the extent of what we'll be able to get into, but we have to be mindful of safety and access as we go through. So I'm going to ask here, and I'll ask again the groups that we're touring with to stay close as a group, because we will get into the public rooms of this lower floor of the manor house, and also into the carriage house, which is an extraordinary construction, which we are conjectured that the Guastavino company was involved in, even though it doesn't have their signature vaults. We believe that there's a relationship between this building and the stable building that was built. And I'll end with the family portrait, really, of all the structures on the island. wherein one sees a really diverse array of uses and a diverse array of construction types. And this is a launch pad in many ways to our thinking about the application of different uses in these various buildings. A stable doesn't make for a great house. A squash court doesn't make for a ballroom, et cetera. So we're going to be bringing the spatial criteria that's evident in a set of drawings like this to, and using these to test the speculative application of different uses that we're hearing you all bring to the table. So with that, I kind of conclude the man-made, the human-made portion of the island, which is extraordinary, but maybe not even as extraordinary as its ecological formation. And with that, I'll pass to Josh.
How's everybody doing? Have the donuts worn off? The sugar high sort of come down? So if you didn't have a donut, they're fantastic. But anyway, my name is Josh Wilson. I'm a senior ecologist with Biohabitats. Really, Biohabitats' mission is to restore the earth and inspire ecological stewardship. The work we do is really to account for ecological resources and really bring the bridge between human uses and ecological resources and try to find that happy medium wherever we can. But also to encourage restoration and preservation, conservation of those natural resources. And to do that, we were brought on to take a look at the island at all different levels, and really we look at it from levels that are from local to regional to global areas. And really what we do is we take the approach of looking at it as a part of the landscape. Great Island does not exist by itself. It exists within the context of what surrounds it, and what surrounds it is not just immediately surrounding it, but also regionally surrounds it. So we look at the patterns of the structure, the patterns and structure of the ecology on the island and around it, and the relationships to those patterns. So we talk globally, Great Island and most of Connecticut is, and in fact all of Connecticut is within the eastern or Atlantic migratory flyway. So if you're into birds, and you know that this is a major pathway for songbirds, but also for hawks and other raptors that fly through here. Cormorants, everybody knows the Canada geese that fly through and get on our lawns and are everywhere, but we know that they're coming through these areas. So it's an active flyway. The great egret, which actually nests off the shore of Connecticut on several rookeries along the Connecticut shoreline, there's one rookery that is actually not too far from Great Island in this area. And then songbirds like the magnolia warbler who migrate, in the spring, early spring, and in the fall, and make their stopovers in these areas, but also may find these areas to breed within. And as we shrink down a little closer to the island, we think about it in terms of its ecoregion. We're here on the Long Island Sound coastal lowland. It's and really an area that's been shaped historically by glaciers and water. That we have a lot of hardened shorelines, a lot of shallow bedrock in these areas, and shallow glacial till. So I think these areas, are very active in terms of dictating the type of vegetative communities that exist. We also see a slightly warmer or milder condition here. So the species that growing along the coastline here are a little different than what we've seen a little further inland. And then as we talk about, as we get even closer to the site, we talk about land cover and what's, a lot of times we key in first to the vegetation, what grows in these areas. And so what we're looking at here is a mile radius and the land cover within that. And, if you notice to the west is Stamford, and a large area amount of impervious surface within that area. But as you move closer to Darien and Great Island, really we're seeing a lot more vegetation. And Connecticut is amazing in that 200 years ago, it was practically denuded of vegetation. It was largely cleared for agriculture, and since then has come back as forested area. We are about 60% forested across the state. given our population. And a lot of that is natural forest or continuous forest, but there is a significant amount of urban and suburban forest areas that exist. And so, although these forest areas tend to be a little bit more fragmented, they do provide a significant and substantial habitat for species in the area. And that's what we see here. These species are actually pulled from a site called iNaturalist, where the public can crowdsource and provide observations of species in your backyard as you're going for a walk, anywhere really in the world. And these are a handful of the species that have been observed, within that sort of 1 mile area of Great Island, and for that matter, on Great Island. Some notable ones, again, the great egret, plenty of turkey and deer. There is a bald eagle nesting on the island, a pair. So, there's a lot of wildlife opportunity because Great Island itself has a lot of ecological habitats on it itself. So we as a company spent a couple days out on the island, but we also relied upon some data that's available publicly and from you individuals in the public to help us understand the island and what's there. So really, I'm going to go over a very high level that goes into greater detail in terms of what we've submitted to the advisory committee. But really, we look at this and we looked at and identified 11 major ecotypes within this. The largest of which is probably the maritime woodland, an upland woodland consisting largely of oaks and hickories and those types of species. Really dictated by that shallow till and bedrock area. But then, other important areas we found were tidal marshes on or adjacent to the site. We also have some, what we refer to as manicured woodlands, areas where maybe you have a strong overstory, but then understory is managed by mowing and maintenance. And then other areas such as inland wetlands and old pastures that seem to have been left fallow and allowed to grow and provide habitats. And so when we're looking at these field observations, we can look at it from two different directions. We can look at it from communities like these that we're talking about, and we can look at it from species. And I'll talk about the species in a little bit. But really our major site observations and opportunities, which were reflected earlier in the talk, come down to really three things: conservation, restoration, and education. So really the importance that we see on this island is to conserve a lot of the natural habitats that have developed. The island, like most of the state, had been cleared, and so this is not virgin, pristine forest that exists, but it is well-developed oak hickory forest in this area. So it provides really important habitat, and so maintaining and conserving that maritime woodland is really important for the species that can breed in that area and also just forage in those areas. Also looking at tidal wetlands, again, they're not significant tidal wetlands on site. In fact, most of them are immediately off site, but they are important nonetheless, and I think that they provide the habitat and the resources for species that are there. And so managing those areas, protecting those areas, but managing them for invasive species is a really important aspect. And then lastly, really the bird habitat across the entire island and other wildlife species across the island is important in the conservation aspect. We talk about restoration. In restoration, there's really, the immediate and most obvious restoration opportunities on the island is management of invasive species. Everything from European swallowwort to Phragmites, species that really outcompete our natural and native species and create a situation where our native wildlife then are diminished in their ability to succeed. So really looking at those areas, but then also restoring some of the areas that may be unique, like the pasture and hayfield areas, to more natural communities, maintaining those through regular annual mowing and that type of stuff to discourage tree growth, but and encourage more annual and perennial species growth and pollinator habitat. And the last is education. I think that, this is probably the most important of the three, if not second important to it, is that getting everybody to understand the importance of the ecology of the site and understanding, what this site provides, what its limitations are as well, but what it does provide in terms of species, really understanding the level of usage by wildlife, the importance to the overall ecosystem locally in Long Island Sound and the coastal Connecticut, and really providing the opportunity for resources in terms of facilities to educate. It's one thing to be able to come out to the site and walk it, but to be able to have a place where you can then sit and talk about those things. Maybe it's a bird walk, or maybe it's a tree identification or species plant identification, and so you want the opportunity to be able to sit and look and discuss that, and that educational. So there's really an opportunity there. And then the last is planned management. Really, we want to be able to educate on why we need to manage and how we manage the island for the conservation. So identifying areas that are exceptionally sensitive or unique on the island, and identifying those areas, and then educating people as to why they are unique. And our recommendations had come to, and along those things had come to here, which I've been talking about generally, which is sort of really the biggest thing to do, is to develop a long-term conservation plan for the island. What do you want to accomplish? What do you want to conserve? What's important? What do we think as an ecologist is important? And what is that area? What are those habitat areas? How do we make connections between those habitats? What kind of buffers should we be providing? And really within that conservation plan also would be a forest management and invasive species management plan. So really vegetation, identifying what vegetation needs to be controlled more actively versus passively. As within that context, the plan should also look at doing a full inventory. Unfortunately, like I said, we've only had a few opportunities to get out to the site and rely upon other public data that's available. So in order to really understand the site, we're recommending that there be a fuller inventory of the flora and fauna on the island that can span multiple seasons, so we can understand the migration, what's understanding, and again, relying on the public. There are plenty of professional and adventurous non-professional birders and wildlife and botanists out there, and I think that's equally as important as the people that do this as a profession. And then long term, it really becomes implementation. It becomes taking that plan, the conservation plan, and implementing the parts of it. Revisiting it occasionally. It's adaptive. It needs to be adaptive. And so revisiting those recommendations, those plans, and making changes as you need. Implementing, for example, maybe restoration associated with any of the tidal marshes or areas on the site. So really taking that approach. Converting lawn, again, or other unused areas to grassland or pollinator habitat. And to George's point, repurposing some of the existing buildings as a potential education resource, an outdoor classroom to be used periodically. So I'll just finish with the pretty pictures of animals, because everybody likes pretty pictures of animals. Charismatic megafauna. So these are all very nice. We know that there's a bald eagle nesting on a pair that nest on the site. And to that end, really those bald eagles prefer larger wooded areas with tall trees to nest in, very strong, well-branched trees to build their rather large nests. If you've never seen one, it's pretty impressive. Some people describe it like a Volkswagen Bug, the old one, not the new one, upside down. But they build impressive nests. And so really there's that protection of the nesting, and because they're a protected species, both at the state and federal level, there's a requirement to minimize any disturbance to the species. So as Megan mentioned, there's a sort of period between February and July where it's recommended that there's no disturbance within 330 feet of the nest. So really maintaining that is an important aspect of the island. And it's also, again, it gets back to the plan, it's adaptive. The eagles may choose to nest on the island this year, but they also may choose to move to another place. So we all like to, switch things up a little bit, look back at better real estate. So, I think that's but they are sensitive to that. So not driving them away is probably the important part of that relationship. We talk about smaller species like the wood frog. There are several small little wetland pockets on the island. We haven't confirmed that there are vernal pools on the site. They may not have the right period of wetness or hydro period to support vernal pool species, but at this point, we're taking the conservative assumption that there are. But wood frogs require not only a vernal pool, a small pool of water in the spring, but they also require a continuous area of woodland and leaf cover, so for them to be able to get out. And they spend most of their time in those woodland areas. They actually don't spend, it's only their juvenile phases where they're spending in the water. The rest of the time is in the upland areas. Those species and other amphibians really use the upland areas are important resources. I mentioned the great egret. While, again, a lot of the wetlands are off the site, they are adjacent to the site. And so the great egret is a state-listed species, and again, it nests nearby. It uses this area, but also other marshes in the area for foraging and feeding. So again, protecting the habitat for them, the mudflats and the tidal marsh areas, and maintaining that connectivity to those areas. And the last is kind of a funny-looking, cute one, the woodcock, which this one is, again, hasn't been observed on the site, but the opportunity exists on the site, given the old pasture and open field areas. They prefer those grassy open fields, especially during the breeding season, in order for them to be able to do their mating ritual, which is fascinating in itself, that it's this process where the male does a little dance, but also does a little flight where it does a circular pattern up into the air and then dives down and then repeats that, which really, it's kind of a cool thing, but that's the ecologist talking, right? So those are sort of the species that we, just a handful of the species that we look to protect as we look to protect their habitats that exist on the island. So they go in hand when we're looking at this. We're looking at not only the maritime woodland, but what species use the maritime woodland, and the loss of that habitat can result in the loss of species or the diminishment of that population. I believe that was my last slide. So I will be the one to say thank you, but I'll let Becca say the official thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for bearing with our in-depth presentation today, and we welcome you to come and talk to us now. And then we really welcome, I think, we were hoping to take questions. If you can just come and talk right now, that would be great.